In this section, we will discuss network operating systems and virtualization. There are three types of virtualization that we will be discussing. Operating system virtualization, which is also called server virtualization, application virtualization, and VDI, which stands for virtual desktop infrastructure. Let's start out with operating system virtualization. What is virtualization and why should we use it? Let's look at a data center before we had virtualization. Let's look at a traditional server-based network whereby we have multiple separate physical servers. What we have here is the users are at their workstations, and that connects to a switch, and that connects to another switch which goes to the server room. And in the server room we have several servers. We have a file server and an application server and a domain controller and several other servers. Each server is a separate box, and this is the way we typically think of servers. But the problem with server-based networks is it can lead to an inefficient utilization of resources. Here's the example. When we first set up our data center here at CCBC, we got 4 brand new servers, and each one had 4 CPUs and 8 gig of RAM, and at the time that was a big deal. And then what we did was we made the first one our DNS server, we made the second one the DHCP server, the third one we used as a file server, and the fourth one was used as the student registration server. But when we got them all up and running, we found that the DNS and the DHCP servers were only running at 25% of capacity, and that is a waste of 3 CPUs that we could be using elsewhere. And then we saw that the file server and the registration server were both maxed out at 100% utilization, and we cannot really just pull the CPUs out of one box and put them into another. The disadvantage of the traditional method of having separate servers is an inefficient allocation of resources. So the solution is to implement server virtualization, and that's where we install multiple server operating systems on one big computer. An IBM Blade server is a big computer as tall as a person is. And this guy is pulling a blade out of a blade server, and it looks like a lunch tray, but it's actually a blade. And if you look at it, you see that a blade is a circuit board which has 2 microprocessors and 4 gig of RAM. And each blade is kind of like a motherboard, and you know what a motherboard is. It's a circuit board with a microprocessor and RAM. Well, each blade is like a motherboard in that it has 2 microprocessors and 4 gig of RAM. So if you put 32 blades in the blade server, you have 64 processors and 128 gig of RAM, and that is a lot of storage and a lot of memory capacity. And we have 3 blade servers here at CCBC. So to implement server virtualization, what that means is you install multiple server operating systems on one big blade server. And each server operating system is called a virtual machine. The hypervisor is the software that allows the blade server to run multiple operating systems simultaneously. VMware, which is the leader in virtualization, makes the ESXi hypervisor, and that's what we teach here at CCBC. And Microsoft has a hypervisor as well, and they call it Hyper-V. The hypervisor is the software that runs on the big blade server that allows it to run multiple operating systems simultaneously. So when we call a computer an ESXi host, what we mean is that it's a big server that has the VMware ESXi hypervisor installed on it. Multiple virtual machines run on the ESXi host. to view those virtual machines, we go to the ESXi host, and we can say on this ESXi host there are multiple virtual machines running on the ESXi host, and they are using a different amount of RAM and a different number of CPUs. We have multiple virtual machines running on one big ESXi host. Since different servers or different virtual machines have different requirements, we allocate a different amount of RAM and a different number of CPUs to each virtual machine. So on this ESXi host, we have 4 operating systems installed, and each one is called a virtual machine. The DHCP server is assigned 1 CPU and 2 gig of RAM because that's all it needs. The DNS server is assigned 2 CPUs and 4 gig of RAM because that's all it needs. The file server gets 6 CPUs and 8 gig of RAM, and the registration server gets allocated 7 CPUs and 10 gig of RAM. Can you assign 7 CPUs to one virtual machine and 1 CPU to another virtual machine? Absolutely. That's the whole advantage of using virtualization. So let's compare a traditional network infrastructure to a virtualized network infrastructure. In a typical network infrastructure whereby you have separate boxes for separate servers, we have an inefficient allocation of resources. Some servers are wasting CPU utilization and other servers are totally maxed out. But with server virtualization, we have multiple virtual machines running on the big old ESXi host, and then different virtual machines are assigned a different amount of RAM and a different number of CPUs. This is called server virtualization, and VMware is the leader in the field. Now let's discuss application virtualization. In application virtualization, the application appears to be running on the local computer, but it is really running on a remote server. In a typical application such as Microsoft Excel, where does it run? In other words, you go into Microsoft Excel, you add 2 plus 2, you get the sum, and it calculates the number 4. So that 2 plus 2, where does that processing occur? Well, it occurs on the CPU of the computer that you are currently standing at. That is an atypical application. But application virtualization is different. Application virtualization is based upon the mainframe model of computing. A mainframe is a big old computer which has a lot of processing power and a lot of RAM. It's typically stored in a separate glass room. And to get to the mainframe, users stand at a dumb terminal to log into the mainframe. Now, a dumb terminal is only a keyboard and a monitor. A dumb terminal is not really a computer. A PC, a personal computer, has a CPU, and it can add 2 plus 2. But a dumb terminal is simply a monitor and a keyboard. So, users stand at the dumb terminal and they connect to the mainframe. And when a user types 2 plus 2 and presses the enter key, it goes down the wire and it gets added up on the CPUs of the mainframe. All processing occurs on the mainframe. This is the mainframe model of computing. Application virtualization is based upon the mainframe model of computing. In a typical local area network, when a user adds 2 plus 2, that 2 plus 2, that processing occurs on the CPU of the user's own workstation. Now, the user can save the file to the file server hard disk if the user wants to, but all processing occurs on the user's own individual CPU. And all the CPUs on the server are underutilized. But if we implement application virtualization, then the application runs in the RAM of the server and all processing occurs on the server, and therefore the user has access to a larger number of CPUs. The application appears to be running on the user's local workstation, but actually it is running up on the server. In application virtualization, the advantage is that we, as technicians, only have to install the application once on the server. We don't need to install the application on every individual user's computers. And also, the client workstations don't need much processing power because all processing occurs centrally on the application server. But the disadvantage is this can put a heavy processing load on the server. Let's look at a commercial example of application virtualization, and the example would be TurboTax. TurboTax is a program that allows you to calculate your taxes, and you can download the TurboTax DVD and install it on your own computer, or you can run TurboTax online on a remote computer. The old way is to purchase the TurboTax DVD and install it on your own computer. But the new way is to use application virtualization, is to connect to TurboTax's web server, their cloud server, and then to run the TurboTax program on TurboTax's cloud server. This is application virtualization. In application virtualization, the application appears to be running on the local computer, but is actually running on a remote server. Now let's discuss another type of virtualization, and this is called VDI, Virtual Desktop Infrastructure. In VDI, Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, the entire operating system is running on a remote computer. It's sort of like application virtualization, but in application virtualization, only the application is running on a remote computer. In VDI, the entire operating system is running on a remote computer. So let's look at the VDI that we have here at CCBC. What I want to do is I want to connect to a remote server and run Windows 7 on a remote server. So I go to the Internet Explorer and I type http://vdi.ccbcmd.edu and I press the Enter key. And then this is the virtual desktop login. So I type my username, I type my password, and I type login, and then I can select DCOM or the DCOM VDI desktop. I will select DCOM, and what that does is it connects me to a remote server which has Windows running on it, and now I am connected to a remote server running Windows 7 on it. Now, this remote desktop window right here, anything that I do with this window occurs on the remote server. Okay, notice that there are two start buttons. The start button on the very bottom left, if I click on that, then I will be running programs on my own local computer. That is not virtualization. But if I select on the start button, which is within the remote desktop window, then I will be running programs on the remote computer. I will be running Windows 7 on a remote computer. With VDI, the user is standing at a computer right here, and he connects to the server at CCBC and then runs a copy of Windows 7 on the server at CCBC. This is my remote desktop, and this is how I can tell that I'm connected to a remote computer. But if I maximize this guy, then you really can't even tell that you are running an operating system that's actually running on a remote computer. Maybe if you look across the top here, that might give a hint that you're running on a remote computer, but it's really not clear to the user that any programs that the user runs right here are actually running on a remote computer. So with VDI, it appears to the user as if the operating system is running on the local PC, but it's really running on the remote computer. So we have three types of virtualization: server virtualization, application virtualization, and VDI, the virtual desktop infrastructure. I would now like to discuss VMware Workstation, which is a piece of software that allows you to run multiple operating systems on one single computer. It's typically used for testing and development situations. This is VMware Workstation. And on VMware Workstation, you can create a virtual machine and assign it a certain amount of RAM and a certain number of CPUs, and then install an operating system on that virtual machine, which you can do on your own individual workstation. VMware Workstation allows you to run Windows 7 and Windows 10 and 2008 Server and 2012 Server and Linux Server all at the same computer at the same time, assuming, of course, that you have enough RAM. VMware Workstation is usually just used when we are testing these products. A regular user would not use VMware Workstation. And this concludes our section on virtualization.